Okay, continuing our review for week 14. Here we did a checklist on Article 3 and judicial power issues around the judiciary. Still got some more to talk about on that, but I also wanted to put up a video on Article 1, legislative power. So you see the slide here. We're going to go clockwise, starting with the enumerated powers, right? So this is a checklist of subject matter, right, that you need to understand very well in order to do well on the exam, to do well on a bar exam, and to do well in practice if you practice constitutional law. Number one, you have to be familiar with the concept of enumerated powers, right? You have to know the Latin maxim expressio unius est exclusio alterius. And you need to be comfortable with that whole notion, right? That any power not listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, obviously that's your text, right? Whenever you have a question about congressional power, that Congress is limited to the exercise of those powers and does not have police power, right? Those are the big ideas. You also have to be comfortable with the necessary and proper clause and know the two main things about the necessary and proper clause, right? Number one is that it links back, right, to the powers enumerated before the necessary and proper clause, right, the foregoing powers. And number two, what it means, right? Necessary and proper means appropriate. It doesn't mean absolutely, right, required. It means appropriate. So Congress has the authority under the necessary and proper clause to do whatever is appropriate to carry into effect, right, the powers listed before the necessary and proper clause. That requires, by the way, that you be familiar with Congress's enumerated powers. So I can't emphasize that enough. If you're being tested on the necessary and proper clause, right? If I or any professor wants to test on a necessary and proper clause, then what I'm going to ask is whether Congress can do a certain thing. When in my head I know that they have the enumerated power, right, to do that, or at least arguably that whatever I'm asking you about would be an appropriate way to do something like coin money, regulate immigration and naturalization, right? Regulate copyrights, bankruptcy, all that kind of thing. So you have to have some familiarity with the enumerated powers. Again, don't memorize them, but you should know it when you see it. Okay, obviously among the enumerated powers of Congress, the most important is the Commerce Clause. So by now you must have mastered the Commerce Clause, right? You have to know when the question is Congress's law valid? The vast majority of the time you're being tested on the Commerce Clause, so you have to know channels, instrumentalities, and the substantial effects test, and the four factors under the substantial effects test, right? You look at whether it's economic, you look at whether there's a jurisdictional element in the law, right? You look at whether Congress held hearings and made findings, and when you get to the fourth factor, attenuation, you look back to factor one. If you concluded that it was economic in nature, you aggregate, right? If you concluded that it was not economic, you do not aggregate, right? And of course, applying those four factors, if it's non-economic activity and you can't aggregate it, right, that's really going to be a problem for Congress. But again, these are not elements or categories, they are factors to consider. After the Commerce Clause, I put taxing next because, as we discussed in class, a tax question on a constitutional law exam is really typically a Commerce Clause question in disguise, right? So you basically have a Commerce Clause question with an extra layer on it, right? You have to decide whether it's a penalty or whether it's a tax. And if it's a penalty, Congress could only regulate, right, or punish or ban or whatever it's doing if it could have done that under the Commerce Clause. So that brings you right back into a discussion, right, of, in all likelihood, the substantial effects test under the Commerce Clause. So now for both the Commerce Clause and the Taxing Clause, and what's coming next, the Spending Clause, for all three of those, keep in mind the Sebelius case, right? What it added in regard to those are the big three powers of Congress, right? Right there on the bottom half of that pie, right? Commerce Clause, taxing, and spending. When it comes to spending, the way you spot that issue is you see Congress trying to bribe states to do something, right? That's going to be a big Dole type spending question. So speaking of, right, Dole, you have to know the Dole elements. Again, courts call them factors, don't know why, but Dole, or, if you're missing any one of the requirements under Dole, you're going to have a problem. Right, so first of all, spending has to be for the general welfare, right? The provision has to be unambiguous, right? So it has to be very clear to the states, right, that are being bribed, number one, what they're supposed to do, and number two, what they stand to lose if they don't, right? There needs to be some reasonable relationship or nexus between the targeted activity, whatever Congress is trying to accomplish, right, and the spending measure. Then you have, I think, the rather obvious point that Congress is not allowed to bribe states to do something that is unconstitutional. And then finally, you want to look at the issue of coercion, which is something that came up in Dole and was really hammered home in the Sebelius case, right? That Congress is not allowed to coerce states into doing something they don't want to do. Congress may only encourage, offer a mild encouragement, as the court says. So 5% of some program, probably okay. 100% of a program, not okay. But that's how you apply the Dole factors, and that's how you handle a spending problem. Moving along, you need to know the Missouri versus Holland case, right? And that Congress does have the authority to execute treaties, right? As long as, again, it's not violating anybody's constitutional rights, right? Congress can pass a law to execute a treaty, even if, it's iffy whether Congress would have had the authority to do whatever is necessary, to execute the treaty under its enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, right? So executing treaties is sort of an additional power outside, or in addition to Article 1, Section 8 that Congress has, again, as long as it's not violating people's constitutional rights in the process of doing that. And in fact, as we studied, sometimes Congress has to act, to execute a treaty, because the president can't do that unless it is a self-executing treaty. So, finally, under your Article 1 checklist, intergovernmental immunities. This is in your book, and this is a decent way to think about it as a limit on Congress's power, but of course it's an issue of federalism, vis-a-vis the states. And a couple things here. Number one, Congress is not allowed to regulate or tax states as states, which one more time means that Congress is regulating or taxing states because they're states, so it's a tax or regulation that wouldn't apply to this person or this entity unless they work for the state or unless they were the state, and the only reason they're subject to it is because they work for the state or because they are the state. And that brings us to anti-commandeering, You need to know that word, commandeering. And that's a big no-no, Congress is not allowed to reach down into states and take over, state legislatures or state police officers or state law enforcement of any kind and force them to execute federal law, When it comes to executing federal law, that's up to the federal government, And states can't be forced to do that. Again, they can be bribed, but they cannot be compelled, under the commandeering idea. So that's your checklist for Article 1. Obviously, this is a rough review. There's a lot more nuance, and obviously a lot more case law. But if you understand every piece of this pie, and you feel like you've mastered every piece of this, then you're going to be good to go as far as legislative power. So hang in there. I gotta post one more thing about judicial power, the 11th Amendment and all that stuff. But I wanted to get this up as well because this is kind of a bigger area. And so as always, be well, stay safe, and stay tuned.